The sirens were already on before anyone asked a question, red and blue lights cutting across the asphalt like a warning that came too late. A black woman kneeling on the shoulder of the road with her palms raised while an officer's voice tore through the night. Sharp, impatient, certain she did not belong where she stood. No chase, no struggle. Just an assumption made the moment her car was boxed in and her door was ordered open. Witnesses slowing their vehicles not to help but to stare. Phones lifting, breath held. Because something about this scene felt familiar and wrong at the same time. The kind of moment that doesn't explode but sinks into your chest and stays there. The kind that makes you ask what she did before you ever ask who decided she was guilty. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The officer closest to her leaned forward and pointed, his voice loud enough to carry past the cruisers, telling her to shut her mouth, telling her this was not a conversation, telling her that checking who she was would come later if it came at all, because right now she was just another problem pulled over at the wrong time in the wrong body, another car flagged as stolen without proof explained, another decision already made before the computer finished loading, and when she tried to speak, not to argue but to clarify, the answer came back faster than her words, a hand pushing her shoulder down, a knee hovering close enough to remind her how quickly pressure could become pain. And the sentence that followed wasn't about the vehicle or the plate or the database. It was about her, about people like her always having excuses, always claiming mistakes, always thinking they're special, the kind of language that pretends to be procedure but drips with judgment, while the second officer stood back, watching, not intervening, her silence folding neatly into the moment like approval, and somewhere behind them a dispatcher's voice crackled through a radio repeating a report that hadn't been verified yet, but was already being treated like fact. She stayed still, not because she agreed, but because she understood the rules of survival in scenes like this, the rules that say sudden movements get rewritten later, the rules that say tone matters more than truth. And in that stillness the officer mistook restraint for weakness, raising his voice again, asking why she was nervous if she had nothing to hide. As if fear in that position needed an explanation, as if kneeling on gravel with lights flashing inches from your face was supposed to feel normal, and the crowd kept its distance. One man shaking his head like this was unfortunate but necessary, another woman whispering that she should have complied faster, the unspoken agreement settling in that whatever happened next would be justified after the fact. The accusation hardened, stolen vehicle, step-by-step instructions barked out like commands in a drill, hands behind her back, eyes forward, no more talking, and when she said one sentence, calm and measured, asking for a supervisor, it was met with a laugh that landed harder than any insult, because it wasn't cruel, it was dismissive, the sound of someone certain they would never have to answer for how this ended. And as the cuffs clicked closed and the cameras kept rolling, the night absorbed the scene the way it always does, quietly, efficiently, already preparing to forget, unaware that this was only the beginning of a story that would not stay buried where it happened. They lifted her from the roadside not with urgency, but with routine, the kind that treats a human being like paperwork that needs moving, her wrists tight in metal, while the night air carried the low hum of traffic passing, as if nothing unusual was happening, the car door opening and closing behind her with a final sound that always feels louder from the inside. And as the cruiser pulled away, the officer in the front seat spoke into the radio with rehearsed calm, reporting compliance, reporting control, reporting a situation already framed in their favor. She stared straight ahead, not defiant, not pleading, understanding that this part of the process was designed to drain you before you ever reached a room where your words might matter, understanding that explanations offered too early often disappear into reports that no one reads carefully later. The accusation followed her like a shadow: stolen vehicle, possible attempt to evade ownership verification, language that sounded official enough to be trusted even when it was built on a glance and a bias rather than evidence. And when she asked again for a supervisor, her voice even and clear, it was met with silence, not because they did not hear her, but because they had already decided she did not need to be answered. Inside the car, she took a slow breath and fixed her attention on the rhythm of the road, because panic would give them something to justify. And she had learned years ago that staying composed in moments like this was not about dignity. It was about survival, about not giving the situation anything it could twist against you. The officer driving checked the mirror once, then looked away, satisfied that the problem was contained, while the other typed into a terminal with deliberate pauses, as if stretching out the process would reinforce who was in control. And with each mile the distance between the accusation and the truth widened, not because facts were changing, but because momentum was being allowed to build without resistance. She thought about how many times this story had started the same way for others, a stop that became a search, a question that became an order, a doubt that hardened into an arrest, and she wondered how many of those stories ended without anyone ever realizing the mistake, because the person on the other side did not have the resources, the patience, or the platform to push back once the narrative had been set. At the station, the lights were harsher and the air colder, the kind of place designed to strip moments of nuance. And as she was guided inside, her name was asked for the first time, not with curiosity, but with suspicion, as if even the sound of it needed to be tested, entered into a system that did not slow down long enough to question its own assumptions. She gave it without hesitation, watching the screen reflect back a version of herself reduced to text fields and numbers. And when nothing alarming appeared immediately, there was a pause that lingered a second too long, a flicker of irritation crossing the officer's face as if the system had failed to cooperate with the conclusion he expected. Instead of correcting course, he doubled down, muttering about delays and database errors, explaining to no one in particular that these things took time, that people often lied, that caution was necessary, and the logic folded in on itself smoothly. Because in that environment, caution always seemed to mean restraint for one side and patience demanded only from the other. She was seated, told to wait, told this would be sorted out soon, a phrase that never meant the same thing to the person saying it as it did to the person hearing it. And as minutes stretched, she remained quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the value of timing, because she knew that the truth, when delivered at the wrong moment, often gets buried under procedure. What the officers did not know, what they did not bother to check beyond the surface, was that this night was not unfolding in a vacuum, that the woman sitting calmly in front of them had spent years inside courtrooms and chambers where language mattered and records mattered and assumptions had consequences, that she had seen how quickly power could misfire when it stopped questioning itself. And as the clock ticked forward and the paperwork accumulated, the distance between their confidence and their accountability quietly narrowed, unnoticed, inevitable, already moving toward a moment none of them had prepared for. By the time the accusation was written down for the third time, it had stopped sounding like a possibility and started sounding like a verdict, repeated with enough confidence to feel real even to the people who had not verified it. And inside the station the language sharpened, stolen vehicle became suspected theft became potential intent, each word stacking neatly on the last until the story they were telling themselves felt complete. An officer leaned against the counter and spoke loudly enough for her to hear, explaining that people who did not own expensive vehicles often borrowed them, often lied about paperwork, often became defensive when questioned, and the casual way he said it made clear that this was not an analysis, but a pattern he believed he already understood. When she corrected him, not raising her voice, only stating that the vehicle was registered properly, and that confirmation would show that, he cut her off mid-sentence, telling her that now was not the time to argue, telling her that cooperation would look better later, a phrase that carried the weight of a warning disguised as advice. The room itself seemed to close in, chairs bolted to the floor, cameras humming softly, every surface designed to remind you that this was not a place built for comfort or dialogue. And she noticed how quickly assumptions hardened once you crossed the threshold, how the benefit of the doubt never followed certain people inside. One officer joked under his breath about how this would be cleared up eventually if she was telling the truth, but his tone suggested that truth was a secondary concern to procedure, something to be addressed after authority had been fully exercised. She was asked the same questions again, where she was coming from, where she was going, why she was driving that car at that hour, questions that were not illegal but were layered with implication, as if her answers were being measured not against facts, but against expectations she could never meet. Each response was noted, typed, summarized by someone else's words, and she understood how easily meaning could be shifted in that translation, how a calm explanation could become evasive in a report if the person writing it had already decided the outcome. At one point, a younger officer hesitated, glancing at the screen longer than the others had, noticing something that did not fit neatly into the narrative. And for a brief moment, there was an opening, a chance for the situation to reset, but the senior officer stepped in quickly, closing that space with authority, reminding everyone that delays were common, that databases lagged, that caution was necessary, and the hesitation disappeared, swallowed by hierarchy. She sat with her hands folded, posture steady, aware that any visible frustration would be read as confirmation of guilt, and in that stillness she reflected on how many times she had seen this dynamic from the other side, how many hearings she had presided over where small decisions made early had shaped entire cases, how often bias entered quietly, disguised as routine. The officers continued to talk around her, discussing next steps, mentioning holding, mentioning paperwork, mentioning how long these things could take, and not once did they ask the one question that mattered, whether they might be wrong. Instead, the story kept moving forward, under its own weight, propelled by assumption and reinforced by silence. And as minutes turned into an hour, the inconvenience became a confinement, the inconvenience justified because it was happening to someone they believed could absorb it. She asked again for a supervisor, her voice unchanged, and this time the response was irritation, a sigh, an eye roll, a reminder that she was already being accommodated, as if basic rights were favors, as if patience were owed only upward. What none of them acknowledged was that this was no longer a simple stop, no longer a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected, but an escalation driven by ego and certainty, and with every form signed and every box checked, the cost of admitting error grew higher, making accountability less likely with each passing moment. In that space, under fluorescent lights and unblinking cameras, the accusation took on a life of its own, sustained not by evidence, but by belief, and while the officers moved confidently through their process, convinced they were in control, they remained unaware that they were documenting every step toward a consequence they had not imagined, one that would soon force every assumption they had made into the open. By the time the door closed behind her and the lock sounded, the room shifted from temporary to intentional, a holding space that was not meant to harm, but not meant to comfort either. And as she sat there, she could hear the station moving around her, phones ringing, chairs scraping, laughter down the hall that reminded her how separate this moment was from the routines continuing just feet away. The accusation no longer needed repeating because it had already settled into the atmosphere, and outside the room officers spoke about her case in fragments, phrases drifting through the door about delays, about confirmation taking time, about how these situations usually turned out, each comment reinforcing the idea that her presence there made sense to them. What none of them noticed was the subtle shift beginning to take place, not within the system, but around it, as information started to move beyond the narrow lane they controlled. A dispatcher, doing her job carefully, followed protocol and flagged the case for a secondary review due to an inconsistency that did not align with the initial report, a small procedural step that meant nothing on its own but carried weight when combined with the time already elapsed. Meanwhile, a supervisor, pulled away from another matter, glanced at a summary and paused longer than expected, not because the situation was dramatic, but because something about it felt unnecessarily extended, and that pause was the first sign that the narrative might not hold once it left the hands that shaped it. Inside the room she remained composed, aware that this phase was about waiting rather than speaking, about letting the system reveal its own cracks, and she reflected on how often she had seen cases unravel not through confrontation but through patience, when those in power assumed silence meant compliance rather than calculation. Outside, a younger officer asked a question that broke the rhythm, wondering aloud why confirmation was taking so long if the information was supposedly straightforward, and the response came back sharper than necessary, a reminder to trust the process, to stop overthinking, to follow lead. And in that exchange the hierarchy made itself clear, not just in rank, but in who was allowed to doubt. Time stretched further, and with it the discomfort of uncertainty, as the officers involved began to feel the pressure of an unresolved situation, their confidence thinning slightly as they checked the clock, recalculated timelines, and adjusted their explanations to account for the delay. The story they had constructed required resolution, yet resolution was not arriving on their schedule, and that imbalance created tension they did not yet recognize as accountability. A supervisor finally approached the room, not with urgency, but with formality, opening the door and asking a few neutral questions that were not accusations but clarifications. And in his tone there was a noticeable absence of assumption, a professional distance that contrasted sharply with what had come before. She answered plainly, providing information again without embellishment, watching as he listened rather than interrupted. And in that moment the difference between authority used responsibly and authority used reflexively became unmistakable. He nodded, closed the door, and stepped away to verify what should have been checked hours earlier. And as he walked down the hall, the officers who had been certain of themselves moments before grew quieter, their movements less assured, their voices lowered. The shift was subtle but real, a change in posture, a hesitation where there had been none, as the possibility of error entered the room for the first time. In that silence, the power dynamic began to tilt, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to unsettle the certainty that had carried the night forward. She remained seated, hands still folded, knowing that this was the stage where truth did not need to announce itself, because systems built on record and review had a way of correcting narratives that were rushed into existence. What the officers had not considered was that every minute added weight to what would eventually be questioned, every delay magnifying the scrutiny that would follow. And as the supervisor reviewed the information with fresh eyes, the gap between assumption and fact narrowed rapidly. The case had reached the point where witnesses were no longer required for the story to change, because the system itself was beginning to respond, slowly but decisively. And in that moment the environment shifted from one of control to one of reckoning, though none of them yet understood just how significant that change would become. The pressure reached its breaking point not with a shout, but with a decision. When an officer returned to the holding room carrying a form and a tone that had shifted from confident to rigid, explaining that until verification was complete she would remain detained, that procedure required it, that this was standard, words delivered as if repetition could make them fair, and as he spoke she felt the familiar weight of history settle in. The realization that this moment was no longer about a car or a database, but about control being exercised because it could be. She closed her eyes briefly, not in defeat but in recognition, because she had been here before in different rooms and different years, each memory lining up behind the next like evidence no one ever collected. She remembered being a teenager stopped on her way home from school, backpacks searched on a sidewalk while neighbors watched, an officer telling her it was for her own safety. Remembered being a young professional pulled over late at night and asked why she was driving through a neighborhood she worked in. Remembered sitting in a courtroom years later listening to testimony about reasonable suspicion and knowing exactly how elastic that phrase could be. Those memories did not weaken her resolve, they clarified it, reminding her that escalation often happened quietly, when no one thought it would matter later. Back in the present the officer shifted. His stance, arms crossed, explaining consequences as if warning her against resistance she had never shown. And when she asked once more for legal counsel, the response was irritation mixed with disbelief, a comment about how that would only slow things down, how cooperation would make this easier, as if rights were obstacles and not protections. Outside the room voices overlapped, the earlier certainty replaced by tension, officers glancing toward the supervisor's office more frequently now, checking their watches, recalculating, because the situation had grown heavier than expected, and what should have resolved itself had instead expanded into something that demanded explanation. A junior officer approached the supervisor with a printout, pointing to a discrepancy that could no longer be ignored, and the supervisor's expression tightened, not with anger but with concern, the kind that signals awareness of consequences beyond the room. Inside the holding space she sat upright, hands resting on her knees, posture unchanged, because she understood that this was the moment many stories turned, not with resistance but with overreach, when authority pushed just far enough to expose itself. She thought about the countless defendants she had seen whose cases hinged on similar moments. When an extra step taken without cause became the reason a ruling was overturned, when impatience created records that could not be erased, and she knew that what was happening now was being documented whether they realized it or not. The officer returned again, voice firmer this time, instructing her to stand, to move to another room. And when she complied without hesitation, his confidence wavered, because compliance without fear did not fit the role he had assigned her. As she walked down the corridor, she noticed how the environment seemed to shift around her, conversations stopping, eyes following, the atmosphere thickening with the awareness that this situation was drawing attention it was never meant to attract. In the processing area, a camera light blinked on, capturing her face, her calm, the absence of resistance, details that would later matter far more than anyone in that moment understood. And as she was seated again, the supervisor entered the frame, his demeanor professional but noticeably guarded. He asked a few more questions, this time about timing and procedure rather than accusation. And as he spoke, she could sense the balance beginning to tip, not in her favor yet, but away from the certainty that had driven the night forward. The officers who had spoken most loudly earlier now stood back, letting the supervisor take the lead, their silence a marked contrast to the authority they had wielded before. This was the breaking point, not because something dramatic happened, but because too much had already happened, because the accumulation of small decisions had created a record that could not be smoothed over. And as the supervisor stepped away once more to review everything with renewed urgency, the room settled into a tense quiet. She remained composed, fully aware that the line between inconvenience and violation had been crossed, that the system had moved beyond caution into exposure, and that whatever came next would not simply resolve the situation but redefine it. Because moments like this did not end quietly. They ended with reckoning, even if no one was ready to name it yet. The shift came quietly, without announcement, when the supervisor returned holding a folder thicker than before and closed the door behind him, lowering his voice as if the room itself required restraint now, explaining that there were inconsistencies that needed clarification and that additional steps would be taken to ensure accuracy, language carefully chosen to signal caution without admitting fault. She listened without interruption, nodding once, understanding that this was the moment when control stopped feeling absolute and started feeling conditional, when the system that had moved so confidently began to slow under its own weight. She asked a single question, whether she could make a phone call, not framed as a demand but as a procedural request, and for the first time that night the answer was not immediate, the supervisor hesitating, glancing at the officers nearby, calculating the optics of refusal now that doubt had entered the room. He agreed, instructing an officer to remain present, and as the phone was placed in her hand the atmosphere tightened, because the assumption had always been that she needed the system more than the system needed to be careful with her. She dialed a number from memory, not rushing, not explaining herself aloud, and when the call connected she spoke briefly, calmly, identifying herself and stating the location, the nature of the detention, and the fact that verification had been delayed beyond reasonable bounds, her tone measured and professional, the kind that did not ask for rescue but triggered awareness. The officer, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, suddenly attentive to every word, because it was clear from her voice that this was not a casual call, not a plea to a friend or family member, but a notification, the kind that set processes in motion elsewhere. When she ended the call and handed the phone back, the supervisor asked who she had contacted, and she answered simply that she had informed counsel, watching as the word changed the room, shoulders straightening, posture adjusting, authority recalibrating itself in response to a factor it could not dismiss. From that point forward the conversation became more formal, language tightening, officers choosing words more carefully, no longer speaking over her but around her, and the casual commentary that had filled the earlier hours disappeared, replaced by silence and clipped exchanges. Outside the room footsteps increased, a subtle indication that attention was spreading beyond those originally involved, and a lieutenant entered briefly to speak with the supervisor, their conversation low and tense, punctuated by references to timelines and reports. She remained seated, hands folded, observing the transformation with the clarity of someone who had seen it many times before, the way institutions shifted when scrutiny appeared, how quickly confidence gave way to caution, when accountability became possible. The officers who had been most assertive earlier now avoided eye contact, busying themselves with paperwork, adjusting forms, double-checking entries that had been rushed before, and the junior officer who had hesitated earlier looked at her with something closer to recognition than suspicion. The supervisor returned again, informing her that additional verification was underway and that the situation would be reviewed by higher command, his tone neutral but edged with urgency, as if he understood that time itself had become a liability. She acknowledged him and waited, because waiting now served her interests more than protest ever could, and in that waiting the power dynamic continued to invert, quietly, decisively. Radios crackled with updates. Names were mentioned that had not been mentioned before, and a captain's voice cut through the noise asking for a summary, a question that forced the story to be told upward rather than outward, where embellishment became harder and omissions more dangerous. As the supervisor explained, she could hear the shift even without seeing faces, the careful phrasing, the admission of delay, the acknowledgement of uncertainty, each word a step away from the certainty that had driven the night. She understood then that the process she had activated was already working, not through confrontation but through exposure, because once a narrative left the hands that created it, it had to survive examination. When the supervisor returned to her, his demeanor had changed again, more reserved, more deliberate. He informed her that she would be temporarily released from holding pending final confirmation, a phrasing that attempted to preserve authority while conceding ground. She stood as instructed, composed, watching as officers stepped aside rather than closing in, the corridor opening in a way it had not before, and as she was escorted not to another holding room, but to an administrative area, the contrast was unmistakable. This was the silent switch, the moment when power shifted without spectacle, when the system began correcting itself not because it chose to, but because it had been forced to reckon with its own exposure. And as she was seated once more under different lights, she knew that the next phase would not be about whether she belonged there, but about how the night would be explained when it could no longer be contained. Morning arrived with a clarity the night never allowed, and by the time the courtroom filled, the story that had been contained within station walls began to take on a different gravity, one shaped by order, expectation, and the quiet authority of law rather than flashing lights and raised voices. The officers involved stood among others, uniforms pressed, posture restored, telling themselves that whatever confusion had occurred would be resolved privately, administratively, without spectacle, because that was how these things usually ended when the system closed ranks. The bailiff called the room to order, conversations faded, chairs shifted, and the familiar rhythm of procedure settled in, a rhythm that often reassured those who believed they understood their place within it. Then the door behind the bench opened. She entered without pause, without hesitation, wearing the black robe that carried weight before a single word was spoken, the fabric moving with measured purpose as she took her seat, and for a fraction of a second the room failed to register what it was seeing, because the mind resists connections that unsettle certainty. One officer's gaze lifted, recognition flickering and then freezing in place, the memory of the holding room colliding violently with the present, and his breath caught as the realization settled fully, heavy and undeniable. The woman they had detained, questioned, dismissed, and confined now sat elevated before them, the authority of the court resting visibly on her shoulders, and the shift was not subtle, it was seismic. The room rose as one at the bailiff's instruction, but for the officers the motion felt delayed, their bodies responding slower than their thoughts, because standing now meant acknowledging a hierarchy they had inverted only hours before. She looked out over the courtroom calmly, eyes steady, expression composed, and in that gaze there was no anger, only recognition, the kind that confirmed memory rather than sought apology. When proceedings began, her voice carried evenly, controlled, every word precise, and as she addressed the docket, the officers felt the weight of her presence sharpen with each syllable, because this was not performance, this was command. At the appropriate moment she paused, looked directly toward them, and addressed the matter that had followed her from the night before, stating facts without embellishment, recounting the detention, the delay, the refusal to verify, the escalation that had occurred absent evidence, her tone neutral but unmistakably clear. The courtroom held its breath as the implication landed, because the story no longer belonged to those who had first told it. It now belonged to the record. One officer shifted, color draining from his face, the confidence he had worn so easily the night before evaporating under the scrutiny of a room designed to weigh truth carefully. She continued, stating plainly that she had been arrested under the assumption of guilt, that procedure had been cited but not followed, and that authority had been exercised without restraint, each sentence tightening the space in which denial could survive. When she identified herself formally for the record, title and jurisdiction stated with precision, the effect was immediate and irreversible, murmurs rippling through the gallery, heads turning, understanding spreading. The officers stood exposed not by accusation but by context, their actions reframed not as isolated judgment calls, but as failures measured against the very system they served. She concluded without raising her voice, without dramatics, noting that accountability did not require spectacle, only honesty, and that the court would address the matter through appropriate channels, her words signaling consequence without indulging in it. As proceedings moved on, the officers remained standing, rooted in place by the knowledge that the power they had wielded so casually had now been reflected back at them, magnified by law and daylight. The realization settled fully then, not as fear alone but as comprehension, that the woman they had treated as an inconvenience, as a problem to be managed, was the one tasked with ensuring justice was administered fairly, and that the narrative they had constructed would not survive contact with the truth. In that courtroom, under steady lights and watchful eyes, the imbalance of the night before corrected itself in silence, and the reckoning they had not anticipated began not with punishment, but with the unmistakable authority of a judge who did not need to announce her power for it to be felt. The collapse did not happen all at once. It unfolded in layers, each one stripping away a piece of certainty the officers had relied on. Beginning the moment the courtroom session ended and the matter moved from whispered concern to formal review, because once actions entered the record, they could not be managed by confidence alone. Internal affairs requests were initiated with clinical language, timelines were reconstructed minute by minute, and body camera footage was pulled without commentary, allowing the images and audio to speak in their own unvarnished way, revealing interruptions, dismissive tones, and decisions made before verification had been completed. The officers were instructed to submit statements, and in the quiet of administrative rooms the bravado of the night before evaporated, replaced by careful phrasing and visible strain, as each sentence they wrote would be weighed against evidence that did not forget or reinterpret. Supervisors reviewed dispatch logs and noted the delays that had been rationalized as routine, now appearing excessive when placed alongside policy requirements that emphasized confirmation before detention. The discrepancy that had once been minimized became central, the missing verification a fault line running through the entire encounter. And as the review progressed, it became clear that procedure had been cited selectively, applied rigidly to restrain, but loosely to protect. Meetings followed, closed-door discussions where rank offered no shelter from documentation, and questions were asked that no one had prepared answers for. Why escalation continued without cause? Why requests for supervision were deferred? Why assumptions were allowed to guide action when uncertainty demanded restraint? In those rooms, the officers who had once spoken over her now struggled to explain themselves, realizing too late that confidence, without care, had created a record that contradicted their intentions. The department moved deliberately, suspensions pending review issued not as punishment but as necessity, access badges collected, schedules cleared, and the language of consequence replaced the language of control. Outside, the story began to travel, not as rumor but as fact, shared quietly among colleagues and openly among those who recognized the pattern. The familiar arc of authority overstepping and being corrected only when exposure became unavoidable. The judge remained absent from the process she had set in motion, not because she lacked interest, but because she understood the weight of distance, allowing systems to respond to their own failures rather than personalizing the outcome. When findings were presented, they were measured and precise, outlining deviations from protocol, noting bias indicators, identifying failures in supervision, and recommending corrective action that extended beyond individual behavior to training and oversight. The officers received the results in silence, reading words that reframed their actions not as misunderstandings but as violations, the language neutral, yet unforgiving in its clarity. Consequences followed accordingly: mandatory retraining, disciplinary measures, not dramatic but definitive, signaling that the institution recognized the cost of what had occurred even if it could not erase it. In parallel, policy reminders were circulated department-wide, emphasizing verification, de-escalation, and the responsibility to question assumptions, an acknowledgement that the problem had not been isolated to one night or one decision. For those involved, the collapse was complete not when discipline was announced, but when they understood that their credibility had been altered, that future interactions would be measured against this record, that authority once exercised reflexively would now be scrutinized. The power dynamic had not merely shifted, it had inverted, revealing how quickly certainty could crumble when confronted by accountability grounded in evidence rather than perception. The story concluded not with raised voices or public spectacle, but with files closed, procedures amended, and a quiet understanding settling in that the system had been forced to confront itself. In that resolution, the imbalance of the night before found its correction, not through vengeance, but through the steady application of standards that had been ignored until the cost of ignoring them became impossible to deny. The final statement did not arrive as a speech meant to linger for applause. It came as a reflection shaped by experience, delivered with the restraint of someone who understood that justice mattered most when it was steady rather than loud. In the days that followed the review, as reports were finalized and procedures adjusted, she returned to her courtroom with the same consistency she always had, presiding over cases that carried their own weight and consequence. Yet the memory of that night remained present, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how easily authority could drift when unexamined. When the matter was formally closed, she addressed it only once, not to revisit the details, but to clarify the principle at stake, stating plainly that what occurred was not an anomaly, but a reflection of assumptions that had been allowed to operate unchecked, and that the correction mattered only if it led to lasting awareness. She spoke about the difference between power and responsibility, about how the badge and the bench were both symbols that demanded humility, not entitlement, and how the absence of that humility eroded trust far faster than any single mistake. Her words carried through the room with measured force, emphasizing that accountability was not punishment for its own sake, but a necessary function of a system that claimed fairness as its foundation. She reminded those present that procedure existed not to protect ego, but to protect people, particularly those most vulnerable to being misjudged, and that every shortcut taken in the name of efficiency carried a cost that was often paid by someone without the ability to challenge it. In that moment, the courtroom was quiet, not because of fear or tension, but because recognition had settled in, the understanding that justice did not correct itself automatically, that it required vigilance from those entrusted to uphold it. She acknowledged that no resolution could undo the hours spent confined or the assumptions endured, but she affirmed that transparency and reform were the only acceptable responses once error was exposed. Outside the courthouse, conversations continued, not driven by outrage, but by reflection, as colleagues and community members alike discussed what it meant to see authority confronted without spectacle, to witness a correction grounded in process rather than performance. For some, the story served as validation of experiences long dismissed, proof that quiet composure could coexist with firm accountability. For others, it was a warning that confidence without care left a trail that records could not erase. She returned to her work without altering her demeanor, without seeking acknowledgement, because for her the outcome had never been about recognition, it had been about alignment, ensuring that the system reflected the values it professed. In chambers, she reviewed new cases with the same diligence, aware that the smallest decision could ripple outward, shaping outcomes in ways unseen. The officers involved continued their duties under renewed scrutiny, their actions measured against updated standards, the memory of that night reshaping how they approached uncertainty and authority. The department implemented training not as a gesture but as a requirement, embedding verification and restraint more deeply into practice. Over time, the story became less about a single arrest and more about the lesson it carried, that silence was not consent, that composure was not weakness, and that accountability did not need anger to be effective. As she concluded her remarks, she left the room with a simple truth, stating that justice was not proven by how power was asserted, but by how carefully it was applied, and that dignity was not something granted by institutions, but something they were obligated to respect. In that closing, the night that had begun with assumption ended with clarity, not through revenge or spectacle, but through the steady reaffirmation that fairness demanded vigilance, and that when the system faltered, its responsibility was not to defend itself, but to correct itself.